Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
Death on a Rainy Bridge, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Dear listeners, and welcome to another tale from Cozy Mysteries. I'm Stephen, your guide through the labyrinthine corridors of crime and detection. Tonight, we venture into the fog-shrouded streets of London, where autumn rain drums against cobblestones and shadows dance between gaslight and darkness. Our story concerns a bridge, a storm, and a man whose final breath escaped him in circumstances so baffling that even Scotland Yard found themselves reaching for explanations that logic could not provide. Chapter 1. An Introduction to Mystery. It was the great detective, Hercule Poirot, who would ultimately unravel this mystery, though at its outset even his legendary little grey cells seemed challenged by the apparent impossibility of what had occurred. Picture, if you will, a Belgian gentleman of diminutive stature, immaculately dressed despite the inclement weather, his egg-shaped head tilted in contemplation as he surveyed a scene that defied conventional understanding. The Blackfriars Bridge had stood for generations, its ancient stones worn smooth by countless footsteps and London's persistent rain. On this particular October evening, as storm clouds gathered like conspirators overhead, it would become the stage for what the newspapers would later call the impossible murder. Poirot had been summoned by Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard, a man who, despite his occasional frustration with the Belgians' methods, had learned to respect the peculiar genius that lay behind those green. The telephone call had come at precisely 9:30, interrupting Poirot's evening ritual of organising his already perfectly arranged belongings. "Another puzzle for you, Monsieur Poirot," Japp had said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too many inexplicable crimes. "This one's got us all scratching our heads. A gentleman shot dead on Blackfriars Bridge, and not a blessed footprint anywhere near the body. The rain's been coming down steady for hours, but somehow the area around our victim is as clean as a whistle." As Poirot's taxi navigated the slick streets, windshield wipers beating a rhythmic tattoo against the relentless downpour, the detective's mind was already working. In his experience, impossibilities were merely possibilities wearing elaborate disguise. The challenge lay not in accepting the impossible, but in discovering which particular possibility had donned such convincing theatrical garb. The scene that greeted them at Blackfriars Bridge was indeed extraordinary. Police constables had cordoned off the ancient structure, their oilskin coats gleaming under the street lamps. The victim lay sprawled across the bridge's walkway, a man of perhaps 50 years, well dressed in an expensive overcoat that was now soaked through with rain, and something considerably more sinister. "Mr. Edmund Thornweald," Inspector Japp announced as he led Poirot toward the prominent banker. "Pillar of the community, no known enemies. Found by a night watchman making his rounds at approximately 9 o'clock. Single gunshot to the chest. And here's the peculiar bit, no footprints approaching or leaving the body." Poirot crouched beside the deceased, his keen eyes taking in every detail despite the dancing shadows cast by the police lanterns. The rain continued its relentless assault, each drop seeming to wash away potential evidence with methodical efficiency. Yet something about the scene struck him as not quite right, though he couldn't immediately identify what triggered his suspicion. "The weapon?" he inquired, his accent lending a musical quality to the words that somehow seemed inappropriate for such grim circumstances. "No sign of it," Japp replied. "Whoever did this was thorough. The shot came from close range, powder burns on the victim's coat, but there's nothing else to go on. It's as if the killer simply vanished into thin air." Poirot stood slowly, his eyes scanning the bridge's surface with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. The rain drummed against his umbrella, creating a small island of dryness in the surrounding deluge. Other than the police and the victim, the bridge appeared completely empty, stretching away into darkness on both sides like a pathway between two different worlds. "Most intriguing," Poirot murmured, though whether he was addressing Japp or speaking to himself was unclear. "Tell me, Inspector, what brought Mr. Thornweald to this bridge at such an hour, and in such weather?" It was a question that would prove central to unravelling the mystery, though neither man knew it at the time. As they stood there in the rain, with the Thames flowing dark and secretive beneath them, the The first pieces of an elaborate puzzle were already beginning to fall into place. The game, as they say, was afoot. Chapter 2. The Absent Footprint. The peculiarities of the crime scene became more pronounced as Poirot conducted his methodical examination. While Inspector Japp coordinated with the police photographer and the coroner's men, the Belgian detective moved with the precision of a clockmaker, each step deliberate and measured. The rain had indeed been falling steadily since early evening, transforming the bridge's stone surface into a mirror-like expanse that should have recorded every approach and departure. Yet, around Edmund Thornfield's body, the ancient stones told no such story. The absence of footprints extended in a perfect circle, roughly 10 feet in diameter, around the corpse, as if the killer had possessed the ability to walk on air. "Observe, mon ami," Poirot said to his companion, Captain Hastings, who had arrived shortly after receiving word of the case. "The rain? She has been falling for 3 hours, yes? Yet examine the stones carefully. What do you see?" Hastings crouched down, squinting in the lamplight. "Well, they're wet, naturally, slippery as anything. I can barely keep my footing." "Précis. Thornfield. He lies here as peacefully as if he had chosen this spot for an evening nap. No signs of struggle, no indication that he slipped or fell. The rain has soaked through his clothing uniformly, suggesting he had been here for some time before death occurred." The detective's examination of the victim revealed additional mysteries. Edmund Thornfield's wallet remained intact, containing a substantial sum of money and various papers that identified him as a senior partner in the prestigious banking firm of Thornfield, Wesley and Associates. His gold pocket watch still ticked steadily, its chain properly secured to his waistcoat. Robbery was clearly not the motive, Poirot observed, returning the wallet to its original position. This was a crime of purpose, not opportunity. Someone wanted Mr. Thornfield dead specifically, and they chose this location with careful deliberation. Inspector Japp approached, shaking rainwater from his coat. The coroner's preliminary examination suggests death occurred between 8:30 and 9. The night watchman who found him, a Mr. Grimsby, swears the bridge was empty when he made his rounds at 8:15. That gives us a window of 45 minutes at most. And during this time, our killer appeared, committed murder, and vanished without leaving so much as a toe print on wet stone. "It's impossible," Hastings mused. "Impossible is merely another word for improbable, mon ami. What we must determine is which improbability actually occurred." Poirot's eyes had taken on that particular gleam that Hastings had learned to recognize as the herald of revelation. "Tell me, Inspector, has anyone examined the bridge's structure itself? The stonework, the railings, the architectural details?" Japp looked puzzled. "Can't say we have. Seemed rather obvious that the action took place on the walkway. Why would you want to examine the stonework?" Instead of answering directly, Poirot moved toward the bridge's eastern railing, his umbrella casting strange shadows as he examined the ancient masonry. The stonework was indeed old, weathered by decades of London's infamous weather, but still solid and well-maintained. As he traced his fingers along the railing's base, however, something caught his attention. "Most curious," he murmured, beckoning Hastings to join him. "Notice the mortar here, between these particular stones. Does it appear the same age as the surrounding masonry?" Hastings examined the area Poirot indicated, though the poor lighting made detailed observation difficult. "It's hard to tell in this light, but now that you mention it, it does seem slightly different, fresher, perhaps." "Indeed. And notice also the small scratches on the stone surface just below. Fresh scratches, I would say, despite the weathering this bridge has endured." Poirot straightened, his expression thoughtful. Someone has been making modifications to this structure recently. The question is, what sort of modifications, and for what purpose? The implications of this discovery were not immediately clear, but Poirot's years of experience had taught him that details which seemed insignificant often proved crucial. As he continued his examination of the bridge's eastern side, he became increasingly convinced that the answer to this impossible crime lay not in what was present at the scene, but in what was absent. The rain continued its steady assault, and with each passing minute potential evidence was being washed away into the Thames below. Yet Poirot seemed unhurried, moving with the methodical patience of a man who understood that truth, like fine wine, could not be rushed. "We must speak with this night watchman, Mr. Grimsby," he announced finally, "and I should very much like to know more about Mr. Thornfield's activities this evening. A man does not venture onto a lonely bridge in a rainstorm without specific purpose." As they prepared to leave the scene, Poirot took one final look at the impossible crime scene, his little grey cells already beginning to process the contradictions and anomalies that would ultimately lead to the truth. Chapter 3. The Witness in the Shadow. The interview with night watchman Alfred Grimsby took place in the small security office adjacent to the bridge, a cramped space that smelled of damp wool and strong tea. Grimsby himself was a thin, nervous man of perhaps 60 years, whose hands shook slightly as he recounted his discovery of the body. "Been doing these rounds for nigh on 20 years, he explained, accepting the cup of tea that Inspector Japp had provided. "Always the same route, always the same times, 8:15, 9:45, then midnight. Regular as clockwork." "I am Poirot." He leaned forward in his chair, his intense green eyes fixed on the witness. "And when you made your 8:15 round, Grimsby, you are absolutely certain the bridge was empty?" "Certain as I'm sitting here, sir. I always check careful like, especially on nights like this when the weather's rough. Part of my job, isn't it? Make sure no one's trying to... well, you..." Grimsby's voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Bridges, particularly during storms, sometimes attracted those contemplating desperate acts. "Yet, when you returned at 9 o'clock, you discovered Mr. Thornfield's body." "That's right, sir. Gave me quite a turn, it did. Gentleman lying there, all peaceful-like, but clearly dead. Shot through the heart he was, though I didn't see that until the police arrived with proper lighting." Hastings interjected, "Did you see anyone else in the vicinity? Any suspicious characters, perhaps someone leaving the area as you approached?" Grimsby shook his head emphatically. "Not a soul, sir. Streets were empty on account of the storm. Only a fool would be out in weather like this without good reason." Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly at this observation. "Indeed, which raises the question of what good reason brought Mr. Thornfield to the bridge. Tell me, during your rounds, do you ever notice anything unusual about the bridge itself? Any recent changes or modifications?" The question seemed to surprise Grimsby. "Modifications, sir? Well, now that you mention it, there has been some work done recently. Council sent some fellows to repair some loose stonework about 2 weeks ago. Made quite a mess, they did, though they cleaned up proper when they finished." Poirot's eyes lit up with interest. "And this repair work, it was concentrated in any particular area?" "Eastern side mostly. Something about water damage to the mortar. They had scaffolding up for the better part of a week, working away with their tools and so." Inspector Japp exchanged glances with Poirot. "Did you happen to notice the name of the construction company?" "Blackwood and Sons, I believe. Had it painted on their van. Proper professional job they did. Though I must say it seemed odd to be doing such work with winter coming on." After dismissing Grimsby with instructions to remain available for further questioning, the three men found themselves back on the rain-soaked street. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the bridge loomed before them like a giant question mark against the dark sky. "Blackwood and Sons," Japp muttered, making notes in his waterproof notebook. "I'll have the lads check them out first thing tomorrow. Seems like too much of a coincidence that recent construction work happened exactly where we found fresh mortar and scratches." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Very good, Inspector. But tell me, what of Mr. Thornfield's movements this evening? Surely someone must know what brought him out in such weather." "We've got men interviewing his household staff and business associates," Japp replied. "So far, no one seems to know why he left home around 8 o'clock or where he was headed. His wife mentioned that he received a telephone call just before departing, but she didn't overhear the conversation." "A telephone call," Poirot mused. "Most interesting. Someone specifically summoned him to his death. This was no chance encounter, mes amis. This was a carefully orchestrated murder, planned down to the smallest detail." As they walked away from the bridge, Hastings found himself looking back at the ancient structure. Something about the case troubled him beyond the obvious impossibility of the crime. There was a calculated coldness to it that suggested a mind capable of elaborate deception. "Poirot," he said suddenly, "what if we're thinking about this entirely wrong? What if the killer didn't approach the body at all? What if Mr. Thornfield was shot from a distance and the absence of footprints is simply because no one came near him?" The Belgian detective paused under a street lamp, considering this possibility. An interesting theory, mon ami, but the powder burns on the victim's coat indicate close-range firing. No, our killer was indeed close to Mr. Thornfield when the fatal shot was fired. The question remains, how did they arrive and depart without leaving evidence of their presence? As they climbed into their waiting taxi, Poirot's mind was already working through the various possibilities. Somewhere in the contradictions and impossibilities lay a truth that would explain everything. The key was to approach the problem from an unexpected angle, to see what others had missed. The game was becoming more interesting by the hour. Chapter 4. The Banker's Secret. The following morning brought clearer skies, but no immediate clarity to the mystery. Poirot and Hastings made their way to the prestigious offices of Thornfield, Wesley and Associates, located in an imposing Georgian building near the Bank of England. The firm's receptionist, a sharp-eyed woman of middle years, ushered them into the office of Mr. James Wesley, the surviving senior partner. Wesley was a man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to handling substantial sums of money. His office reflected both prosperity and conservative taste, with leather-bound volumes lining the walls and a massive oak desk dominating the room. "Terrible business," Wesley said, gesturing for them to be seated. "Edmund was not only my business partner, but one of my oldest friends. We'd known each other since university. I simply cannot fathom who would want to harm him." Poirot settled into the offered chair with characteristic precision, arranging his gloves and umbrella with minute care. "Mr. Wesley, I understand that your partner received a telephone call yesterday evening, shortly before his departure from home. Do you have any knowledge of who might have contacted him?" Wesley's expression grew troubled. "As a matter of fact, I do. Edmund called me immediately after receiving that telephone call. He seemed quite agitated, though he wouldn't explain the details. He said only that there was an urgent matter requiring his immediate attention, something connected to a client from our past." "A specific client?" Hastings inquired. "He mentioned the name Blackwood, though I must confess it meant nothing to me at the time. We've handled so many accounts over the years that individual names sometimes blur together, particularly those from decades past." Poirot's eyebrows rose with interest. "Blackwood, the same name as the construction company that recently worked on the bridge." "I wouldn't know about that," Wesley replied, "but I can tell you that Edmund was deeply disturbed by whatever this Blackwood person had told him. He mentioned something about old debts coming due and mistakes. That couldn't be undone. It was most unlike him to speak in such cryptic terms." The detective leaned forward, his green eyes intense. "Mr. Wesley, would it be possible to examine your firm's records, specifically any accounts or transactions involving anyone named Blackwood?" Wesley hesitated. "Our client files are strictly confidential, you understand. However, given the circumstances..." He moved to an impressive safe built into the wall behind his desk. "I suppose there can be no harm in reviewing historical records, particularly if they might shed light on Edmund's death." The search through the firm's meticulously organized files took the better part of an hour. Finally, Wesley located a thick folder marked Blackwood Estate. As he opened it, his expression grew increasingly grave. "My God," he murmured, "I'd completely forgotten about this case. It was one of our most controversial matters, handled primarily by Edmund in the early days of our partnership." The file revealed the story of Marcus Blackwood, a wealthy industrialist who had entrusted Thornfield and Wesley with managing his substantial estate. However, according to the documents, there had been significant irregularities in the handling of the account. Large sums had been transferred without proper authorization, and when Blackwood demanded an accounting, the matter had been settled quietly out of court. "Edmund always maintained that he acted within his authority," Wesley explained, though his tone suggested some doubt. "Blackwood accused him of misappropriating funds, but there was never any formal legal action. The matter was resolved through financial compensation, and we assumed it was closed." Poirot studied the documents carefully, noting dates and amounts. "And what became of Mr. Marcus Blackwood?" "He moved to the continent, I believe. Lost track of him entirely after the settlement. That would have been around 1903, so he'd be quite elderly now, if indeed he's still alive." "Children? Heirs who might have inherited both his fortune and his grievance?" Wesley's face paled as the implication struck him. There was a son, Thomas Blackwood. He would be in his 40s now. But surely you don't think— I think, Mr. Wesley, that old secrets have a way of demanding settlement, particularly when those who believe themselves wronged have had 20 years to plan their revenge. Poirot closed the file and stood. We shall need copies of these documents, if you please, and I would strongly advise you to take precautions for your own safety until this matter is resolved. As they left the bank, Hastings found himself marvelling at the complexity of the case. It's starting to make sense, he said. Thomas Blackwood somehow discovered his father's old grievance against Thornfield, decided to exact revenge, and used his construction company to prepare some sort of trap on the bridge. The broad outline is becoming clearer, yes, Poirot agreed, but the specific mechanics of how the murder was accomplished remain mysterious. How does one shoot a man at close range on an open bridge without leaving footprints? That, mon ami, is the key to our puzzle. The answer, when it came, would prove more ingenious than either man had imagined. Chapter 5. The Revelation of Rain. Inspector Japp's investigation into Blackwood & Sons construction proved both illuminating and troubling. The company did indeed exist, registered as a legitimate business with an address in South London. However, when police visited the premises, they found nothing but an empty warehouse with signs indicating the business had ceased operations approximately 1 week earlier. Closed up shop right after finishing that bridge work, Japp reported during their meeting at Scotland Yard. Neighbours say they cleared out their equipment and disappeared overnight. Very suspicious timing, if you ask me. More intriguing was the discovery that the company had been registered under the name Thomas Blackwood, exactly as Poirot had suspected. However, efforts to locate Mr. Blackwood himself had proven fruitless. The address listed on the company registration led to a boarding house, whose proprietor claimed no knowledge of any tenant by that name. A carefully constructed false identity, Poirot mused, studying the police reports. Our Mr. Blackwood has been planning this revenge for some time. The construction work on the bridge was merely the final preparation for his elaborate scheme. But what did he actually do to the bridge? Hastings asked. We know he made modifications to the eastern side, but how did those modifications enable him to commit an impossible murder? Poirot stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the London street below. The weather had cleared, but puddles still reflected the afternoon sunlight, reminding him of the previous night's storm. Suddenly his expression changed, and he turned back to his companions with obvious excitement. Mes amis, I believe we must return to the bridge immediately. There is something I must verify, something that the rain itself may have revealed to us. The trio made their way back to Blackfriars Bridge, where the afternoon sun cast everything in sharp relief. Without the concealing veil of rain and darkness, details that had been obscured the previous evening now stood out clearly. Poirot immediately directed their attention to the eastern railing, where he had noticed the fresh mortar work. "Observe," he said, kneeling beside the stonework. In daylight, the modifications become much more apparent. This section of railing has been recently removed and replaced. But notice the curious detail here. He pointed to a barely visible seam in the stone parapet. This appears to be some sort of concealed opening. Working carefully, Poirot managed to identify a cunningly disguised panel in the stonework. When pressed in a specific sequence, it swung open to reveal a narrow chamber built into the bridge's structure itself. "Mon Dieu," Hastings exclaimed. "It's some sort of hidden compartment." Inside the chamber they discovered several items that immediately clarified the mystery. A coiled rope, still damp from the previous night's rain, a revolver, recently fired, and, most tellingly, a complex pulley system that had been installed within the bridge's structure. "Ingenious," Poirot murmured, examining the mechanism. "Absolutely ingenious. Mr. Blackwood created a hidden chamber from which he could operate without ever setting foot on the bridge's surface." Inspector Japp studied the rope and pulley system with growing understanding. So he could lower himself down from this compartment, shoot Thornfield, and then pull himself back up without leaving any footprints on the bridge deck. "Precisely. But even more clever than that, Inspector. Notice the angle of the chamber relative to the bridge surface. Our killer could fire upward through a carefully concealed opening, creating the appearance that the shot came from someone standing beside the victim. The powder burns would be consistent with close-range firing, but no footprints would be necessary." As Poirot continued his examination, he discovered additional evidence of the killer's preparation. Small holes had been drilled in the stonework to provide visibility and a clear line of fire. The entire setup had been camouflaged so expertly that it would be virtually undetectable, except under the most careful scrutiny. But how did he get into the chamber in the first place, Hastings wondered. Poirot smiled grimly. Undoubtedly from below, mon ami. The Thames provides access to the bridge's lower structure. Our Mr. Blackwood could approach by boat, climb up through this hidden entrance, and depart the same way. The rain would wash away any evidence of his aquatic arrival and departure. The discovery of the hidden chamber explained the impossible nature of the crime, but it also revealed the extraordinary lengths to which Thomas Blackwood had gone to exact his revenge. The construction work had been a months-long project to create the perfect murder weapon, the bridge itself. "We must find him quickly," Japp said grimly. "A man capable of this level of planning and patience is extremely dangerous, and according to the bank records, he may not consider his revenge complete with just Edmund Thornwield's death." As they examined the evidence, Poirot noticed one final detail that would prove crucial to capturing the killer. Hidden within the chamber was a single sheet of paper, protected from the rain by a waterproof cover. It was a confession, written in Thomas Blackwood's own hand, detailing not only his motives for revenge, but also his plans for the future. And, according to the document, Edmund Thornwield had been merely the first victim on a carefully planned list. James Wesley was scheduled to be next. Chapter 6. The Forged Farewell. The document discovered in Blackwood's hidden chamber proved to be far more complex than a simple confession. As Poirot examined it under better lighting back at Scotland Yard, he realized they were looking at what appeared to be a suicide note, supposedly written by Edmund Thorndyke himself. "Most peculiar," the detective murmured, adjusting his reading glasses. "The handwriting appears authentic, the paper is of high quality, and the content suggests a man driven to desperate action by guilt over past financial irregularities. Yet we know with certainty that Mr. Thorndyke was murdered." Inspector Japp leaned over Poirot's shoulder to read the document. "I'm on it. It says, 'I can no longer live with the knowledge of what I did to Marcus Blackwood and his family. The weight of my crimes has become unbearable, and I choose to end my life rather than face the consequences of my actions.' Sounds convincing enough to me." "Too convincing," Poirot replied. "This note is a masterpiece of forgery, but it contains one fatal flaw that reveals the true author's identity. Notice the phrasing here, 'The weight of my crimes has become unbearable.' This is not how an English gentleman of Mr. Thornwield's generation and education would express such sentiments." Hastings studied the document more carefully. "You're right. The language seems slightly foreign, as if written by someone whose native tongue is not English." "Exactement. Our Mr. Thomas Blackwood spent his formative years on the continent. Remember, his father moved the family to Europe after the settlement with Thornfield and Wesley. Despite his obviously excellent command of English, certain continental expressions have crept into his writing. The forged suicide note revealed the full scope of Blackwood's revenge plan. He had intended to stage Thornfield's death as a suicide, using the impossible nature of the crime scene to reinforce the idea that the banker had taken his own life in a moment of overwhelming guilt. The hidden chamber would remain undiscovered, and Blackwood would escape suspicion entirely. "But something went wrong," Poirot continued. "Perhaps the timing was disrupted by the storm, or Mr. Thorndyke didn't position himself exactly where expected. Blackwood was forced to abandon the suicide staging and simply flee, leaving the note behind as evidence of his true intention." An urgent telephone call interrupted their analysis. Inspector Japp answered, his expression growing increasingly grave as he listened to the report. "That was the surveillance team watching Mr. Wesley," he announced after hanging up. "Wesley received a telephone call at his office about an hour ago, similar to the one Thornfield received yesterday evening. He's left the building and appears to be heading toward the Thames." "Mon Dieu," Poirot exclaimed, leaping to his feet. "Blackwood is attempting to complete his revenge tonight. We must stop him before he claims his second victim." The trio raced through London's darkening streets, the police car siren clearing a path through the evening traffic. Japp radioed ahead to coordinate with the surveillance team, but the reports were alarming. Wesley had been seen walking toward the river, apparently alone and moving with purpose despite his advanced age. Where would Blackwood arrange to meet him? Hastings wondered aloud as they navigated the crowded streets. Somewhere with symbolic significance, Poirot replied grimly. Not the same bridge. That would be too obvious now that we've discovered his method. But somewhere connected to water. Somewhere that would allow him to stage another impossible crime. As they approached the Thames, Japp received another radio update. Wesley's been spotted near London Bridge, sir. He's standing at the railing, apparently waiting for someone. London Bridge stretched before them as they arrived, its Victorian stonework solid and imposing against the evening sky. Unlike the previous night, the weather was clear with only a gentle breeze stirring the river below. James Wesley stood alone near the centre of the bridge, his figure silhouetted against the lights reflecting on the Thames. "Mr. Wesley," Poirot called out as they approached, "you must not remain here. You are in grave danger." The elderly banker turned toward them, his face pale with confusion and fear. "I don't understand," he said. "I received a call from someone claiming to have information about Edmund's death. He said he would meet me here at 9 with evidence that would clear our firm's reputation." "It's a trap," Japp announced, scanning the bridge and surrounding area for signs of hidden threats. "Thomas Blackwood is here somewhere, planning to kill you, just as he killed your partner." As if summoned by his name, a figure emerged from the shadows beneath the bridge's southern approach. Thomas Blackwood was a man of perhaps 45 years, with the lean build of someone accustomed to physical labour. In his hand he carried a revolver, identical to the one they had discovered in the hidden chamber. 20 years, Blackwood called out, his voice carrying clearly across the water. 20 years I've waited to balance the scales. My father died in poverty because of what your firm stole from him. Tonight, justice is finally served. The confrontation had begun, and Poirot realized that all his deductive skills would be tested in the next few crucial minutes. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. At twilight, Thomas Blackwood stood perhaps 30 feet away, positioned strategically near the bridge's southern approach, where the shadows provided concealment. His revolver remained pointed steadily at James Wesley, though his eyes occasionally darted toward Poirot and the police officers who had begun surrounding the area. The bridge had been cleared of other pedestrians, leaving the small group isolated against the backdrop of the Thames and the glittering lights of London. "Mr. Blackwood," Poirot said calmly, stepping forward with his hands clearly visible. "I am Hercule Poirot. I believe we should discuss this matter like civilized men. Your father's grievances were legitimate, but murder will not restore his honour or your family's fortune." "Civilized?" Blackwood's laugh was bitter. "Was it civilized when Thornfield embezzled my father's money? Was it civilized when he forced us into exile, driving my father to an early grave through worry and shame? You speak of civilization, but you know nothing of justice." Inspector Japp was coordinating quietly with his officers, positioning them to prevent Blackwood's escape while avoiding actions that might precipitate violence. "I know more than you might think," Poirot replied, continuing his slow approach. "I have read the files from... Your father was indeed wronged, but not in the way you believe. Mr. Thornfield was guilty of poor judgment, perhaps, but not of deliberate theft." "Lies!" Blackwood's voice rose, and his grip on the weapon tightened. "I have the documents, the evidence my father gathered before he died. Thornfield systematically looted our family's accounts, using his position of trust to finance his own investments." "And yet," Poirot continued, now close enough to see the pain and anger in Blackwood's eyes, "if you have truly studied those documents, you will have noticed certain discrepancies, amounts that don't balance, dates that don't align, signatures that, upon careful examination, prove to be forgeries." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Blackwood's face. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting, mon ami, that your father was the victim of a different crime entirely. Someone did indeed steal from his accounts, but it was not Edmund Thorntonfield who committed this theft." The revelation hung in the air between them like a physical presence. James Wesley, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly stepped forward despite the danger. "Thomas," he said quietly, "if you'll lower that weapon, I can show you documents that your father never saw. Evidence that came to light only after the settlement was. We've been looking for you for 20 years to make proper restitution." "More lies," Blackwood snarled, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Poirot seized the moment of doubt. The true thief was Mr. Carruthers, the firm's senior clerk at that time. He had access to all client accounts and possessed considerable skill at document forgery. When your father's losses were discovered, Carruthers cleverly arranged for suspicion to fall on Mr. Thornfield, who was too honourable to fully defend himself, rather than expose the firm to scandal. But Thornfield accepted responsibility, Blackwood protested. Because he felt responsible for not detecting Carruthers' crimes sooner, Poirot said gently. And because, like many men of honour, he preferred personal sacrifice to public scandal that might harm innocent clients. Wesley's voice carried the weight of old grief. We discovered the truth 3 months after you and your father left England. Carruthers had fled to South America with nearly $50,000 stolen from various accounts. The weapon in Blackwood's hand began to waver as the implications struck him. You're saying I killed an innocent man, a man who spent the last 20 years trying to locate us and make amends? Poirot confirmed gently. Edmund Thornfield was not your enemy, Mr. Blackwood. He was perhaps the only man who truly understood your father's pain. The psychological impact of this revelation was devastating. Thomas Blackwood's carefully maintained hatred, the foundation of 20 years of planning and preparation, crumbled in an instant. The weapon fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the bridge's stone surface. Inspector Japp moved quickly to secure the revolver while his officers approached to take Blackwood into custody. However, the man offered no resistance, standing motionless as if turned to stone himself. He tried to tell me, Blackwood whispered, his voice barely audible above the Thames flowing below. When I called him to the bridge, when I revealed who I was, he said there were things I didn't understand, that my father had been wronged but not by him. I thought it was just the desperate lies of a guilty man. What exactly did Mr. Thornfield say to you? Poirot inquired gently, his detective instinct still working, even as he felt genuine sympathy for the broken man before him. He said, Blackwood's voice cracked with emotion, he said he'd been searching for us, that there was money waiting, money that rightfully belonged to my father's estate. He begged me to listen, to let him explain, but I was so consumed with hatred, so certain of his guilt, I pulled the trigger before he could say another word. James Wesley approached slowly, his own eyes wet with tears. Thomas, your father was a good man who trusted the wrong person. Carruthers was brilliant at manipulation. He fooled all of us initially. But Edmund never gave up trying to find you. He set aside money every year, accumulating interest, waiting for the day when he could make proper restitution. The full tragedy of the situation was now clear. Thomas Blackwood had spent 2 decades planning revenge against a man who had been trying to help him. The elaborate murder scheme, the months of preparation, the ingenious hidden chamber, all of it had been directed at destroying someone who had never been his enemy. The amount now stands at over $100,000, Wesley continued. Edmund insisted on adding interest and penalties for every year we couldn't locate you. He considered it a debt of honour. Inspector Japp, having secured the scene, approached Poirot with evident admiration. How did you know about this Carruthers fella? That information wasn't in any of the files we examined. It was there, mon ami, but hidden among seemingly routine correspondence. A letter from a bank in Buenos Aires, dated 1904, inquiring about references for a former London banking clerk named Carruthers. Mr. Wesley's meticulous record-keeping preserved every document, even those that seemed insignificant at the time. As they prepared to leave the bridge, Thomas Blackwood looked back at the Thames flowing beneath them. I've spent half my life preparing for this moment, he said quietly. I learned construction, studied engineering, planned every detail of a perfect murder, and all for nothing. All based on a lie I told myself so many times I believed it was truth. Perhaps not entirely for nothing, Poirot observed. Your skills in construction are considerable. They could be put to more constructive purposes. And now, at least, you know the truth about your father. He was not defeated by treachery, merely betrayed by misplaced trust. The arrest of Thomas Blackwood marked the official end of the case, but Poirot knew that the real resolution would take much longer. A man's entire worldview had been shattered in the space of a few minutes, and rebuilding from such devastation would require time and considerable strength of character. As they walked away from London Bridge, Hastings found himself marvelling at the complexity of human nature. It's tragic, really. 20 years of hatred based on a fundamental misunderstanding. C'est la vie, mon ami, Poirot replied sadly. The human heart, it is capable of sustaining great love and great hatred for equally long periods. The tragedy is when the hatred is based upon false premises. Truth, as always, provides both liberation and devastating consequences. Chapter 8. The Weight of Truth. The following morning brought no celebration for solving the case, only the sobering reality of justice delayed and lives irrevocably altered. Poirot sat in his favourite chair, methodically arranging his breakfast items with characteristic precision, though his usual enthusiasm for order seemed subdued. Inspector Japp arrived early with updates on Thomas Blackwood's formal charges and the complex legal proceedings that would follow. The case had attracted considerable attention from the press, though the more sensational aspects, the impossible murder and the hidden chamber, were being kept confidential to avoid inspiring copycat crimes. Blackwood's been completely cooperative, Japp reported, settling into the offered chair with evident fatigue. He's provided detailed information about his methods, his preparations, everything. Says he wants the full truth to be known no matter the consequences to himself. His mental state? Poirot inquired, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Fragile, I'd say. The prison doctor is concerned about depression, possibly worse. Having your entire life's purpose revealed as fundamentally wrong, well, it's enough to break anyone. Hastings entered from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee and wearing an expression of troubled thoughtfulness. The case had affected him deeply, particularly the revelation that years of careful planning had been directed at the wrong target entirely. "Any word from Wesley about the estate funds?" he asked as he poured coffee for the group. "That's actually why I'm here," Japp replied. "Wesley's been in touch with his solicitors about transferring the accumulated funds to Blackwood. Apparently, even attempted murder doesn't void a debt of honour, at least not in Wesley's mind." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Mr. Wesley understands that justice sometimes requires compassion rather than strictly legal remedy. The money cannot restore the years of exile and poverty that the Blackwood family endured, but it may provide some measure of healing." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Hudson announced that a young woman wished to speak with Poirot about the Blackwood case. She gave her name as Miss Catherine Blackwood, and her relationship to the accused murderer became immediately apparent when she entered the room. She was perhaps 25 years old, with the same dark hair and serious expression as her brother, but without the bitter hardness that years of planning revenge had etched into Thomas's features. Her clothing was simple but well maintained, suggesting modest circumstances maintained with dignity. "Mr. Poirot," she began, her voice steady despite obvious emotional strain, "I've come to thank you for discovering the truth about our father's death. Thomas sent word from prison explaining everything that happened." "Mademoiselle," Poirot replied gently, "I fear that my discovery of the truth has brought your family little comfort. Your brother faces serious charges, and the knowledge that your father was innocent of the crimes he believed himself guilty of cannot restore the years lost to exile." "You're wrong about that," she said firmly. "Our father spent his final years consumed by guilt and shame, believing he had been foolish enough to trust someone who betrayed him. Knowing that he was actually the victim of a clever criminal, that he was guilty only of having a generous nature, that knowledge is precious beyond measure." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a worn leather journal. "This belonged to our father. I found it among his effects after he died in Berlin 3 years ago. It's filled with entries about his regret over trusting Thornfield, his belief that he should have seen through what he thought was a scheme to defraud him." Poirot accepted the journal and carefully opened it to a random page. The handwriting was careful and precise, the words of a man trying to make sense of financial ruin that had destroyed his life's work. "September 15th, 1908, he read aloud. "I continue to reproach myself for my blindness regarding Thornfield's character. How could I have been so naive as to entrust my fortune to someone whose greed exceeded even his apparent respectability? My poor children pay the price for my foolish trust." "Every entry is like that," Catherine continued. "Years of self-recrimination, of believing he was a poor judge of character, who had failed his family through gullibility. Thomas read these journals after father died, and they reinforced his conviction that Mr. Thornfield was our family's destroyer. The tragic irony was almost overwhelming. Marcus Blackwood had died believing himself a fool for trusting a thief, when in reality he had been an honourable man betrayed by a criminal's clever deception. His journals had inadvertently planted the seeds of his son's misguided revenge. "Will you tell me about Carruthers?" Catherine asked. "I need to understand who really destroyed our family." Inspector Japp consulted his notes. James Carruthers, senior clerk at Thornfield and Wesley from 1895 to 1903. Brilliant with figures, trusted with access to client accounts, and apparently possessed of considerable charm. He systematically embezzled funds from multiple clients, always careful to make the thefts appear to be investment losses or accounting errors. When your father began asking difficult questions about his portfolio's performance, Poirot continued, Carruthers cleverly redirected suspicion toward Mr. Thorndyke. He forged documents, manipulated records, and presented a convincing case that the junior partner was using client funds for personal speculation. "And then he disappeared," Japp added. "Fled to South America with approximately $50,000 stolen from various accounts. By the time his crimes were fully discovered, he was beyond the reach of British law." Catherine absorbed this information with apparent calm, though her hands trembled slightly as she returned her father's journal to her handbag. "So the real criminal escaped justice entirely, while my brother planned to murder 2 innocent men." "Not entirely innocent," Wesley's voice came from the doorway, where he stood with Mrs. Hudson's permission to enter. "Edmund and I both bear responsibility for not detecting Carruthers' crimes sooner. We were fooled by his competence and charm, and our failure allowed him to destroy your family's security." The elderly banker approached Catherine with obvious emotion. "Miss Blackwood, I cannot return the years your family lost, but I can ensure that the financial damage is finally repaired. Your father's money, with accumulated interest, amounts to a considerable sum. It belongs to you and your brother, regardless of the current circumstances." As the morning progressed, the full scope of the tragedy became clear. 2 families had been destroyed by one man's greed and cleverness, and the effects had rippled across decades, ultimately leading to murder based on false premises. The truth had finally emerged, but at a cost that seemed almost too heavy to bear. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. 3 weeks after Thomas Blackwood's arrest, Poirot found himself once again contemplating the complexities of human justice. The formal legal proceedings had begun, with Blackwood's defence counsel arguing for reduced charges based on the extraordinary circumstances that had motivated his actions. The case had become a cause célèbre among London's legal community, raising questions about moral responsibility when crimes were committed based on fundamentally false beliefs. "The prosecution is pushing for a murder conviction," Inspector Japp reported during one of his regular visits to Poirot's chambers. "They argue that Blackwood's motivation is irrelevant. He planned and executed a deliberate killing. The defence counters that he was, essentially, the victim of a fraud that drove him to temporary insanity." Poirot stirred his coffee thoughtfully, his green eyes reflecting the complex emotions the case had stirred. "And what of Mr. Blackwood himself? How does he view his situation?" "That's the strangest part," Japp replied. "He's refused to cooperate with his own defence, insists he's guilty of murder and should face the full consequences, says that his ignorance of the true facts doesn't excuse his actions." This stoic acceptance of responsibility was entirely consistent with what Poirot had observed of Thomas Blackwood's character. Despite the misdirection of his energies, the man possessed a strong moral compass that now compelled him to accept punishment for his crimes, regardless of the circumstances that had motivated them. Hastings entered the room carrying the morning newspapers, several of which featured prominent coverage of the case. The press had dubbed it the Bridge Murder Mystery, and public opinion seemed divided between sympathy for Blackwood's tragic circumstances and revulsion at his carefully planned revenge. "There's been an interesting development," Hastings announced, settling into his chair with evident excitement. "Catherine Blackwood has hired her own investigator to track down Carruthers. Apparently she's determined to see the real criminal face justice, even after all these years." Mademoiselle Catherine possesses admirable determination, Poirot observed, but I fear that after 20 years the trail has grown quite cold. South America is vast, and a man with stolen money can disappear quite effectively. There, conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Wesley, who appeared considerably aged by the recent events. The elderly banker carried a leather portfolio and wore the expression of a man bearing heavy news. "Gentlemen," he began without preamble, "I've just received word from our investigators in Argentina. James Carruthers is dead, has been for over 15 years, according to official records in Buenos Aires." The revelation struck the room like a physical blow. After all the pain and tragedy, the discovery that the original criminal had already faced his final judgment seemed almost anticlimactic. "Natural causes?" Poirot inquired. "Yellow fever," Wesley replied. He'd been living quite well on stolen money, but tropical disease doesn't respect ill-gotten wealth. Wesley opened his portfolio and extracted several official documents. "These are certified copies of his death certificate and related records. I thought Miss Blackwood should have them for closure." "And what of the money he stole?" Hastings asked. "Did he leave any estate?" "Nothing recoverable, I'm afraid. He appears to have spent lavishly and invested poorly. By the time of his death, he was reportedly living in reduced circumstances in a boarding house." The irony was bitter. Carruthers had destroyed the Blackwood family's fortune and reputation, driven them into exile, and indirectly caused Edmund Thornwield's murder, only to die in poverty himself 7 years later. Justice of a sort had been served, but far too late to prevent the subsequent tragedy. "I've been thinking about the trial," Wesley continued, "about what I might say if called to testify on Thomas Blackwood's behalf. The boy was wronged, there's no question of that. Not by Edmond, but by circumstances beyond his control." Poirot leaned forward with interest. "You would speak for the defence?" "I would speak for the truth. Thomas Blackwood is guilty of murder, but he's also the victim of a crime that destroyed his family 20 years ago. Perhaps the law can find room for both." As if summoned by their discussion, Catherine Blackwood arrived for what had become a regular visit to discuss her brother's case and her family's future. The news of Carruthers' death struck her with visible force, though she received it with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the ordeal. "In a way, it's a relief," she said, after Wesley had explained the situation. "I'd been imagining him living comfortably somewhere, enjoying the fruits of his crimes while our family suffered. Knowing that he died in poverty at least provides some sense that justice was served." "And your brother?" Poirot asked gently. "How does he receive this news?" "I visited him yesterday. He seems almost relieved that Carruthers is beyond earthly justice. Thomas says it removes any temptation to seek further revenge and allows him to focus on accepting responsibility for his own actions." The conversation turned to practical matters: the disposition of the recovered funds, Thomas's legal representation, and Catherine's plans for rebuilding her life. The money that Edmund Thornwield had carefully preserved would provide financial security, but emotional healing would require much more time. As the afternoon wore on, Poirot found himself reflecting on the nature of justice and revenge. Thomas Blackwood had devoted half his life to planning the destruction of innocent men, driven by false beliefs that had been strengthened by his father's own tragic misunderstanding of events. "The saddest aspect," he confided to Hastings after their visitors had departed, "is that if Monsieur Marcus Blackwood had lived just a few months longer, the truth would have emerged naturally. The bank's investigation into Carruthers' crimes was already underway when he died in Berlin, and Thomas would have learned that Thornfield was trying to help, not harm, his family." Exact. Instead, the father's journals became the foundation for the son's misguided quest for vengeance. Truth delayed became truth denied, with consequences that echoed across 2 decades. The case was nearing its conclusion, but Poirot knew that its effects would continue to reverberate through the lives of all involved for years to come. Chapter 10. The Final Judgment. The trial of Thomas Blackwood began on a grey November morning that seemed to mirror the sombre mood surrounding the case. Poirot attended as a key witness, though his testimony would focus primarily on the technical aspects of how the crime had been committed, rather than the complex motivations behind it. The courtroom was packed with observers, including several prominent members of London's banking community, and a contingent of journalists, covering what had become one of the year's most discussed criminal cases. Thomas Blackwood sat in the dock with quiet dignity, his appearance neat despite his weeks in custody. "The defence does not dispute the basic facts," his counsel announced during opening statements. "Mr. Blackwood did indeed plan and execute the murder of Edmund Thornfield. However, we contend that he did so while labouring under a fundamental misapprehension about the victim's character and actions, a misapprehension that was itself the result of criminal fraud perpetrated against his family 20 years ago." The prosecution countered with the argument that motivation, however tragic, could not excuse deliberate murder. "The defendant spent months planning this crime," the prosecutor declared. "He constructed elaborate mechanisms, forged documents, and carefully orchestrated his victim's death. This was not a crime of passion, but of cold calculation." Poirot's testimony came on the second day of the trial. He described the ingenious murder method in detail, emphasizing the extraordinary patience and skill required to construct the hidden chamber within the bridge's structure. "This was not the work of an unbalanced mind," he told the court. "Mr. Blackwood demonstrated remarkable engineering ability and attention to detail. His methods were those of a sane man pursuing what he believed to be justified revenge." Under cross-examination, Poirot was asked about Blackwood's mental state during their confrontation on London Bridge. "He was devastated by the revelation that he had killed an innocent man," Poirot replied. "But he immediately accepted responsibility for his actions and offered no resistance to arrest. This suggests a man of fundamentally sound moral character who had been driven to extreme measures by false beliefs." James Wesley's testimony proved particularly compelling. The elderly banker described in detail the events of 1903, including the discovery of Carruthers' crimes and Edmund Thornfield's lifelong efforts to locate the Blackwood family and make restitution. "Edmund died trying to help the very people he was accused of wronging," Wesley told the court, his voice breaking with emotion. "He set aside money every year, accumulating interest, waiting for the day when he could restore their family's fortune. Thomas Blackwood killed the one man in London who was truly his friend." Catherine Blackwood was called as a character witness for her brother. Her testimony about their father's journals and their family's years of exile painted a poignant picture of lives destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. "My brother is not a violent man by nature," she told the court. "He was driven to this terrible act by a lifetime of believing our family had been betrayed by someone we trusted. The discovery that this belief was false has been as devastating to him as our father's original financial ruin." The trial's most dramatic moment came when Thomas Blackwood himself took the stand, against his lawyer's advice. He insisted on testifying about his actions and motivations. "I am guilty of murder," he stated simply. "Thornfield was an innocent man who died because of my hatred and my failure to seek the truth before acting on my assumptions. The circumstances that led to my crime do not excuse it, and I accept full responsibility for my actions." His refusal to make excuses or seek sympathy clearly affected the jury, though whether this would work in his favour or against him remained unclear. The trial concluded with closing arguments that reflected the case's fundamental moral complexity. The defence argued for manslaughter rather than murder, based on the extreme emotional circumstances and Blackwood's genuine belief that he was seeking justice. The prosecution maintained that premeditation and careful planning constituted clear evidence of murder in the first degree. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of manslaughter, accepting the argument that Blackwood's actions, while inexcusable, had been motivated by circumstances beyond his control. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, noting that while the crime was serious, the defendant's acceptance of responsibility and the extraordinary circumstances merited some consideration. "Thomas Blackwood will serve his sentence," the judge declared, "but he will do so with the knowledge that justice, though delayed, has finally been served in regard to the original crimes that destroyed his family." As the court proceedings concluded, Poirot found himself standing outside the courthouse with Catherine Blackwood and James Wesley. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter, a reminder that time moved forward, regardless of human attempts to correct past injustice. 12 years seems both too much and too little, Catherine observed quietly. Too much for a man who was essentially seeking justice for his family. Too little for the murder of an innocent person, perhaps. Perhaps, Poirot replied. That is the nature of justice in an imperfect world. We can only hope that Mr. Thomas will use his time in prison to find peace with his actions and prepare for a different kind of life when he is released. Wesley nodded thoughtfully. I've arranged for the accumulated funds to be placed in trust for both of you. Thomas will have resources available when he completes his sentence, and you can begin rebuilding your life immediately. As they parted company, Poirot reflected on the strange nature of the case that had brought them together. A crime based on a fundamental misunderstanding had ultimately revealed truths that had been buried for 20 years. Justice had been served, though not in the manner anyone might have expected. Another case closed, Poirot? Hastings asked as they walked toward their waiting taxi. Closed, yes, but not concluded, mon ami. The effects of these events will continue for years to come. Thomas Blackwood will serve his sentence and perhaps find redemption. Catherine Blackwood will rebuild her life with the knowledge that her father was an honourable man, and somewhere the spirit of Edmund Thornfield may finally rest, knowing that the truth has been revealed at last. As their taxi pulled away from the courthouse, Poirot settled back into his seat with the satisfaction of a man who had served truth and justice, even when they proved more complex than anyone had imagined. And so concludes another tale from the files of the great Hercule Poirot, as witnessed and recorded through the eyes of one who observed his method. Until our next mystery, dear listeners of Cozy Mysteries, remember that truth, like the Thames itself, has a way of eventually flowing toward the light, no matter how many obstacles may attempt to divert its course.